All right, without further ado. Good afternoon. My name is Chris O'Donnell. I'm currently in the UN Office of Counterterrorism. I get like a lot of reactions, oh no, it's that guy. We're a fairly new office, and I think there's ambiguous feelings about it. But I just wanted to first of all thank Siobhan and the whole team here for inviting me. I'm kind of an old dog with association to this project, and I'm just so impressed with the way that it's developed over the years into something so evidence-based and so relevant. And it's just really nice to come back, and I just saw it in its little infancy, and now it's all grown up. So it's really nice to see. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my background, a little bit why it's relevant, and then more importantly, let's talk about the presenters here and why their presentations are so relevant. I mainly have a DDR background, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, for like 20 years. And I went through different, I guess, iterations of that world, going from starting in Northern Ireland. I was in Eastern DRC when it was FDLR, that was the main armed group. In Haiti, when it was more gangs and armed groups. And now I'm kind of in what we're calling terrorists now. And really, some people look at me and go, well, what's all these different things? I think it's perfectly consistent. I view armed groups, I like the name of MEAC, Managing Exits from Armed Conflict, that's it. I think we get really tied up in a lot of these different silos of how we think about it that I think are becoming less and less useful and more of a barrier to how we look at things. In 2019, I went from DDR and went to UNOCT, the UN Office of Counterterrorism, which is a little bit controversial because it's very much a category, so much so that terrorism's not defined in the UN. How do you have a UN Office of Counterterrorism? It's a problem with naming conventions. 3 minutes, all right. Okay, I better get going. So what I'm saying, there's a range of different armed groups, but I think everything from, I said, gang members to people who may or may not be terrorists, to criminal elements. But I really think what really matters is the context in which you're working. And I think we've got to pay more attention to that and less attention to, attention to the specific responses to a specific context rather than fancy ideas and concepts. With coming to New York, that's what I've learned. Being in New York for a long time at this headquarters type policy level is we love these clean concepts and acronyms. And I think these field people here, most of you out there, know that nothing in managing armed groups fits into a cleanly ordered conceptualization, let alone an acronym. And I think that's where we kind of fall short. My most recent experience of that is, okay, I was in DDR, now I'm supposed to say PRR, prosecution, reintegration, and rehabilitation. Why? Because there's a political necessity to emphasize, if it's a terrorist, that they're accountable and prosecuted. I agree with that. That's an important element, but if we emphasize too much the acronym, changing it, I never agreed with the change from DDR to PRR, and I'm not supposed to say that, but I think it's just acronym bingo. I think we should really focus on what you're going to hear today. And why I'm so pleased to be here is that MEAC's not about looking at concepts, per se. It's about, sorry, I don't know what's, I got to turn the page. It's about the evidence, and it's about the important details and indicators of a very human situation on the ground and how you react to that as it is, not try to fit it into some concept you dreamed of. So evidence-based policy and decision-making is what's required, not clever, often politically sanitized concepts. I think we've got to get into the brass tacks, and our presenters here do just that. Mohammed is going to talk about Nigeria and Boko Haram. I've often talked about this in the context of PRR when people say they're going to PRR Boko Haram. I can't remember how many Boko Haram there are. Somebody give me close estimate, but I do know you can't prosecute them all. And so what are you going to do? And a lot of people who emphasize prosecution don't want to hear that. They want to hear this fits in my conceptual idea of this. Not to say there shouldn't be prosecution. It's just to say that we have to look at the reality. He gets down into more brass tacks, what I like to hear about. Expectations of these people. Reintegration into what is what he asks. What about recidivism? What about the fact you're in active conflict? These are the important questions rather than the concept. Ángela, Colombia, one of my favorites. Mario and I used to say, this is we were in the DDR section together, that we were always envious of Colombia. There was a lot of money involved and developed a very sophisticated legal system because it was more political and a negotiated settlement, very different than Boko Haram. But Ángela is going to talk about the legal uncertainties and many other things, but that's what I really have always been fascinated by. I've been to Medellin once, but I went to the judicial system, and it's a very unique and interesting. And Lila, last of all, I think this is about criminology and research. Let's use what we have. There's a vast base of relevant evidence that I think we can pull from and use. Not always new. We're always going for these new concepts and dreaming up new ideas. The stuff we have, the evidence, what's going on in the ground, what's in front of you, instead of imaginings, I think is more important. So, and Mario, I'm not sure you're presenting, but I'm not sure. Discussant. He's more the discussant. So Mario and I have worked together for a long time, so he's not doing a presentation, but helping to facilitate with the discussion. So without further ado, I'm really interested to hear from all these three. I'll hand over to Mohammed about Bukar. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It will be my pleasure to present to you about the integration of ex-associates who have come out of Boko Haram or an armed group that is still active. For those of you who were at the panel yesterday, you might recognize some of the things that I will be presenting on. And so without further ado, because the scope of MEAC has already been highlighted by several times by my colleagues, I will skip it here and quickly highlight that while there is indeed relative peace in northeastern Nigeria, such as places like Maiduguri, the conflict is still very much ongoing, and ISWAP is still carrying out attacks and holding on to territory. For this presentation, I would like to briefly highlight some of the obstacles to exiting an armed group that is still active, and then move on to what comes after exiting. At the end of my presentation, I will highlight some findings on recidivism and some of the reasons why people might get back to an armed group they have exited. You will notice that I will largely focus on Boko Haram today, and it's because I will be presenting on CSAS tomorrow on a different panel. Let me start by stating the obvious here. Not everyone is exiting yet, and the conflict is still ongoing. We are, of course, interviewing people who are coming out of Boko Haram, and that often means that we are interviewing those who wanted to come out in the first place. I don't want to spend too much time explaining the current exit pathways in northeastern Nigeria. For those of you who might not be very familiar with the context, I will just highlight the fact that there are several federal and state-led processes that overlap each other, each with their own shortcomings and challenges. For those who were with Boko Haram, many are, of course, still in detention in maximum security prisons across Nigeria. It is important to highlight that people often spend years in detention before a decision is made about their sentence. and whether they are considered low risk or whether they are released. For those who are considered low risk, there has been a federal rehabilitation program called Operation Safe Corridor since about 2016. People spend time in several facilities and receive programmatic interventions ranging from medical care, vocational training, and are reunited with their families later on. In addition, there is a smaller and separate high-level, high-risk group that negotiated their exit from Boko Haram called the Sulhu Program. And we got access to a small sample of those, and we were able to interview them too. Following Shekau's death in the May of 2021, the government of Borno State put out messages encouraging people to come out, promising them that they will not be killed if they did. Thousands of individuals surrendered to the military and were transferred to transit centers across the city of Maiduguri. The government speaks of more than 80,000 who have come out so far, and this includes a lot of women and children. This picture right there is of people who came out as part of that mass surrender. In the September of last year, we ran focus groups with them after they exited the Hajj Transition Center in Maiduguri. And the Borno State government has put forward a model for dealing with this particular caseload. It is worth highlighting that women and girls in the past have often been bypassed when it comes to programming. When they surrendered to the military, they are often returned directly to their communities. Within the Borno model, however, there is a focus on keeping family units together, so women and children get to stay with their husbands at those transit centers. And then lastly, of course, we should assume that many people bypass these processes and just quietly exit and make their way back to their communities and elsewhere. Before we move on to talk about reintegration, I will highlight some of the expectations that people have when they exit, because they might hinder reintegration in the future. Many might think it possible, might not think it possible to leave. We asked those who came out whether they thought it was possible to do so, and we also asked what they thought was going to happen when they left. Interestingly, for Boko Haram, it does seem like majority of them thought it was possible to leave the group. And however, when we look at what they thought will happen after leaving, it becomes clear that most of them were not necessarily thinking they will be allowed to reintegrate. We also asked people what they thought will happen when they left, and as you can see, a significant minority of people thought they will be killed by the military when they left Boko Haram. Of course, many also said they didn't think anything will happen, and many others said they will return to their own communities or a different one. 2 data points to highlight here. 1% of respondents said they thought they would receive some sort of reintegration support after coming out, or they will be let into Operation Safe Corridor, which I mentioned earlier. To be clear, this data is from those who have left Boko Haram before the mass surrender started. We are planning on doing research with the people who are part of the mass surrenders too, so that we can compare them. And my guess is that these results will be a bit different, given the fact that the mass surrenders were a direct result of the government reaching out to people and telling them what they will expect if they come out. This leads me to the importance of information and whether people have a sense of what might happen to them when they leave an armed group that is still active. I also mentioned earlier that we did focus groups last September with a group who were part of the mass surrenders. Most said that they had wanted to leave for years but didn't think it was possible to do so. They then heard the governor on the radio saying that they will not be killed if they came out, and they were in touch with those who had already left by phone. And as a result, they learned they were indeed not getting killed on exiting. And this gave them a confidence, a kind of a confidence to come out to. I will now move on to what happens after people leave Boko Haram and after they leave the transit centers. I think it is important to stress that it is difficult to really talk about reintegration in the case of northeastern Nigeria. As I said before, the conflict is still ongoing, and in addition, those who are leaving armed groups are doing so against a backdrop of a serious humanitarian crisis that is further compounded by the conflict and vice versa. In our midline survey sample, roughly half of the former Boko Haram associates that we interviewed was still displaced, and of those, roughly half currently live in IDP camps. When we were doing focus groups with the mass surrenders last year, it became clear that it was too early to really talk about reintegration for that group. They were all displaced and living in IDP camps. They were struggling with lack of food and water, as well as lack of access to healthcare and lack of access to schools for their children. They had concerns about being close to active members of Boko Haram, and most were struggling with finding jobs or being able to continue to farm. And however, they might need, even though they might need food and shelter now, this might, of course, change over time. If people do go back to their communities, they often live in very close proximity to the armed group that they just left. And that makes it really challenging to avoid association. In our surveys, we have asked people if people continue to help the armed group in any way after they left. We have very low percentages of people who admit to doing so. This could be, of course, because people are likely aware that it might be problematic to admit to doing so, especially if they had gone through some sort of programming or if they had promised that they would no longer help the group. I wanted to highlight this quote right here from someone who said that they had continued to help Boko Haram with driving. And obviously the name that's there, it's fake. Lastly, it seems complex to really talk about reintegration when the conflict is still ongoing. And these groups are still quite active, but clearly many do want to come out, even while the groups are still active. And at the moment, many are struggling with basic needs provision, and the conflict dynamics will impact whether exits are permanent or not, and whether people will switch between different factions or come out and stay out. Again, we have to understand that desistance is complex when you have to go back to areas where the group is still active, and it might be quite impossible to avoid association with them. Thank you very much. That's it from me.
Thanks very much, Mohammed. That was very insightful as to what's going on right now. I learned a lot. And Ángela, do you want to go now with Colombia?
Thank you very much. And as Mohammed said, probably most of the people who were yesterday already saw this presentation, but I would like to focus on certain issues that yesterday we addressed. But first of all, I would like to give a quickly overview about what are the three basically ways to get out from the conflict. The first one is reintegration, that is for individuals. The second one from individuals, and is the traditional process that we have since like the last 15 years. The second one is reincorporation. That is the program that was created for the peace, from the peace agreement with the FARC-EP and the government. And the third one is the differential assistance process. That is the official exit pathway for individuals who leave criminal groups. and basically they are defectors or they have been captured from these groups. And I would like to highlight this process because this is something that we have been discussing in the workshop early and during the launch, and it is this like a specific context that brings the criminal groups in Colombia. So just to follow the idea of these specific criminal groups that we have three kind of groups now. The ELN, that is Ejército de Liberación Nacional, that is the only guerrilla group that we consider now. And the other ones are basically referred them in like a hybrid between criminal groups, like Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, that is one of the main criminal groups that we have. Actually, the security minister said recently that it is almost 4,000 people with this criminal group, and the dissident groups with the FARC, from the FARC, sorry, that are divided into two kinds, the Estado Mayor Central and Segunda Marquetalia, and the difference between them depends when they were created, before the peace agreement or after the peace agreement. So some of the challenges that we are facing now with the demobilization of these defectors are basically, as I say, this idea and tension between criminal groups and political groups, especially with the criminal groups, because we have the challenge to understand how are they threatened today, our security and our communities' protections. And especially with the dissidents, because we have clearly, or at least we don't have a discussion about what is the Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, but we had a discussion about what is the dissidents group, what are, and what is the nature of these groups. And basically, there is someone who say that this is a hybrid nature, and they are referring especially to this idea if they were into the peace agreement or they were living after the peace agreement. And the position from the government, the last government, was that they were criminal groups, and they name it like that. So that administration provide legal permission to use military force against them or to kill or capture their members. But now the current context is different because they have separated the dissident groups between those who are able to have a political approach, that is the Estado Mayor Central, and the reason why Estado Mayor Central has a political approach is because they fell apart the peace process before the signing. And the other one is about those who were after that, and the idea with them is that they are going to be treated as criminals, and in that way they have to go through the ordinary justice. And this, I'm focused a little bit more in this because this is a tension that we have now, and that it has certain implies in the DDR process that we are offering to them. It has certain implies about what are the pathway to exit for these groups, especially because we are talking with them as individuals, not as a groups. And also, the other issue with them that I forgot to say is because of the community's reception about the dissident groups and the Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, all these criminal groups, is the perception of the communities. And they don't know exactly what are the difference in the way how they operate in the territories. That brings a lot of challenges for us, like to present them and for the reception if they want to be involved in the community's projects. So, as I said yesterday, the security, and this morning, the security threats against defectors is one of the main issues that they are facing. Not just only because they are defectors, but also because they have been treating like the expertise for war. They know how to do work. So for those criminals groups, or either all the groups that are not going to be in total peace, that is the governance strategic for this government. For those who are not going to be, it means that they are always going to be in a threat, basically, because that's the easy way to get recruitment in that way. And actually, 60% of the respondents of MEAC survey reported that they had been threatened by their armed group that were formed for, that they defect for, which means that this is something that the differential assistance process has to face every day, day to day. Also, with the security threats, there is something, and it's that it means that they have to be changing her residency all the time. And it is a challenge for the official institutions to have to accompany these people in their process. So usually they lost the process for reintegration. Even though when most of the people that we have the opportunity to interview from the differential assistance process say that even when they receive offers to go back to the armed groups, they won't accept that. They want the opportunity to start a new life. There is a few that were tempted, and they were tempted because of the security threats and also because of the legal uncertainty. And as I said, this is a major issue right now, basically because the degree that put in a context this opportunity to get exit from individuals, there is no clear about what are the legal benefits for them. So all the institutions that are involved in the implementation of this decree have their own interpretation, and in that way the participants receive mixed message from them, even though some of them had been already arrested because they were during the process, but one institution received an interpretation of how the benefits are going to work, and the other side, basically the ARN, they are trying to do it like in a more integral way. So that's something that affects the institution, the whole institution's entity trust from the participants. And the other issue is that this happened in a context where we keep having like a conflict context. As I say, the expertise for this ex-combatant is very, very interesting for criminal groups. Also because, sorry, I'm thinking this point. Yeah, also because it is not so easy to lose like the contact. It is not so easy just to be away of these criminal groups. Even basically most of the respondents, as you can see, they were able to contact a criminal group in an hour or a week. That's really, really fast if they were thinking to rejoin. And also because they have family or friends who are also connected to the criminal groups. So some implications for current defectors' efforts and total peace must to ensure that to do like certain clarifications about how it's going to be, especially because now we are talking about individuals coming out from the criminal groups, but there is also the conversation to see if we can do a collective dialogue, and it brings a really challenging issue from them. The other one, the other implication is the idea to provide several services for them, and with this is something that we have been talking this day and yesterday, and it's about like bring it in, like in an integral way, with economic projects and with all the differential perspective that brings this exit path. And with the thinking about the differential exit path, that something that is really interesting is that even though if we assume the negotiation, or if we assume like a legal, just individual dialogue for legal benefits, the reality is that the most affected population that we have now are even though indigenous or Afro-Colombian people. And it means that they had been recruited as well from these criminal groups. So we have to address in a very specific differential perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ángela. I think I was really struck by the fluidity of that situation. The categorizations change, the context is continually evolving, and the different responses. I'm also really happy so far. I've seen, I think, no acronyms, which is amazing for New York. So thank you very much. And I think now we'll switch gears a little to the criminology perspective with Lila. So.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here and to provide some perspectives from the field of criminology. I really want to highlight 5 key insights today from evidence-based criminological research that bear relevance for the study of exits from armed conflict groups. And I'm going to end with a few specific insights from gang and terrorism research more specifically. So the first point I want to raise is that much like the process of desistance from crime or from any other form of harmful behavior, whether it be substance use, smoking, bad eating habits, exiting an armed conflict group may be best regarded as a process rather than a finite event. It's a process that's characterized by reversals of decision and ambivalences and ups and downs. So gang researchers have made similar observations about exiting gangs. So behavioral change is generally not linear. Relapses are a normal part of the process. So I think it's important to normalize relapses for offenses that don't pose a threat to public safety. And so from an intervention standpoint, we need to better identify periods where individuals find themselves at a turning point, at an ambivalence point about engaging within the group, and to provide additional support during those periods and alternative options that might facilitate the transition out of the groups. And I think it's really important to highlight here that when temptations are high and when structural barriers are significant, even the highest level of motivation to change is going to fade in the face of these overwhelming obstacles. At least this is what we learn from research about reintegration of former prisoners. The second point I want to raise is that while the criminal justice system traditionally focuses on punitive responses, it is equally important to provide incentives to promote the decision to exit armed conflict groups. So we really need to build stronger paths to redemption by providing individuals with alternatives, educational, professional, or other, to involvement in criminal activities. So this is a challenging task in the developing world because these opportunities are not necessarily widely available. And it's also important here to adopt more comprehensive markers for success and redemption beyond just the absence of recidivism. We also want to look at indicators of social integration, if somebody has addiction issues, whether they're making progress on that front, shifts in self-identity, et cetera. So looking beyond just the behavioral outcomes. Third, the challenges of returning to society after exiting an armed conflict group can be paralleled to the obstacles confronting by returning citizens after a period of incarceration. So I list some of them here. Many returning citizens are returning to less than ideal conditions, as you all know. And again, many parallels here to the experiences of former prisoners. Difficulties in reconnecting with family and friends, especially after a long period of time away. The challenges in adopting new roles, new self-identities. The policy barriers, this is a pretty significant one, especially here in the US, that limit access to housing, employment, education, and other conventional social institutions. We know, for instance, in Latin America, some gang members have difficulty leaving the country and going into having a fresh start because they have an affiliation with a certain gang. So these policy barriers are also pretty important. And a lot of these policies are extremely stigmatizing, and they prevent the process of desistance from crime. Another challenge is coping with the temptations when the social network remains active in crime. This is a topic that's been recurrent here today and yesterday, and the fact that people have limited alternative opportunities, perhaps because of their deficiencies in their educational or professional backgrounds. Another important point here is that coerced change is not so conducive to lasting effects. This is true for individual level interventions. You can't force people into programs. This is true for community interventions. This is also true for at the national level when trying to impose systemic change on a country that doesn't come from the people itself. So the desistance paradigm places the actor rather than external interventions at the heart of the process of change. So programs work because people choose to participate in them. There's a very strong selection bias here. And the research on gang prevention interventions showed that they've actually had a very limited effect in reducing offending behavior. And these are projects that we've spent a lot of money on in trying to sort of reduce criminal behavior as a result of gang membership. The one example of intervention I want to give here is Boston's Operation Ceasefire, which was adopted in the 1990s. In the city of Boston in the 1990s was grappling with very high gun violence rates. Excuse me. And so Operation Ceasefire brought together various criminal justice agencies, including law enforcement, prosecution, et cetera, and they brought in gang members. They gave them a seat at the table, and they told them the violence has to stop. So drug dealing is not a priority for us for enforcement, but the violence has to stop. So if the violence doesn't stop, we will come at you with everything we have, even if you spit a gum on the sidewalk. And this is something that led to reduced rates of violence. So while we can say that the gang members didn't have much of a choice, at least they were given the illusion of choice by being invited to the table and to sort of being given the option at least to reduce the violence in their activities. And the last point from the field of criminology more generally that I want to raise is that contacts with the criminal justice system really have limited deterrent effects and may actually disrupt the desistance process. So it may foster persistence in crime rather than promote desistance from crime. So except for cases that involve clear threats to public safety, researchers agree that confinement should be used as a last resort, especially among adolescents and emerging adults. So imprisonment impedes the desistance process in many ways. And when I say especially for adolescents and emerging adults is because what the age crime curve shows us is that past the point of late adolescence and emerging adulthood, so ages 18 to 24, crime rates start going down. So sometimes punitive criminal justice interventions targeting adolescents and emerging adults interrupt an otherwise downward slope of offending, meaning that if we had left people, they would have probably desisted out of crime. But the punitive response to it is something that actually ends up promoting persistence from crime. We also know from brain development research that the part of the brain that regulates impulse control, the prefrontal cortex, is not fully developed until about age 25. So again, there would have been a natural decline in crime that would have occurred had we not intervened in a punitive way. I also want to highlight that the more punitive approaches do not result in reduced offending. There's a large body of research on this. Longer prison sentences do not result in lower recidivism rates. So again, highlighting that the punitive approach is not always more appropriate, and often it's not. Lastly, I want to raise a few insights from research on desistance from gangs and from terrorism. So there's the concept of pushes and pulls. So push factors are factors that make involvements in gangs or terrorist groups less appealing, that basically drive individuals away from the network. And pull factors are influences that are external to the network that draw people to conventional social roles. So I think it's important to capitalize on these factors to facilitate exits. And also an important distinction here is disengagement versus de-radicalization, also drawn from terrorism research. So disengagement is the process of ceasing terrorist activity, so that's more of a behavioral element. And de-radicalization is more pertaining to the attitudes, right? So it's the process that leads someone to change their attitudes about violence, and specifically about the appropriateness of violence against civilians. So disengagement does not necessarily imply de-radicalization. So you can have a change in behavior without having a change in attitude, and there might be physical disengagement from terrorist activity, but no change in violent ideology per se. So for counter-terrorist efforts, researchers argue that disengagement is more important than de-radicalization, because you can have disengagement without a change in attitudes. So gang researchers also found that leaving a gang doesn't necessarily equate a cessation of involvement in crime or even serious violent crime. You can leave a gang and still be involved in serious crime. And the last concept I want to raise here from gang research that's important is gang embeddedness, which is pretty important. It's the level of immersion in a network. Excuse me. So instead of focusing on self-identification as a group member, gang researchers talk about reducing the criminogenic impact of group membership by working on minimizing the embeddedness in the group, by reducing ties to the group, and by increasing ties to non-members of the group. And so by the de-identification as a group member will eventually become more likely as well by focusing on the embeddedness. And just to conclude, many of you have heard the expression of being tough on crime. So this is an approach that is actually not tough on crime. We tend to be tough on the so-called criminals, right? And which tends to be a very stigmatizing and punitive approach. So it's a very moralistic approach in trying to shame individuals out of crime, but it ends up having the counter effects of what it's supposed to do. So when we talk about being tough on crime, we're not actually tough on crime. We're tough on the individuals who engage in crime, and this has not proven to be a very effective approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lila. I think there were very interesting parallels you draw between criminology, crime, and violent actors, including terrorists. One of the things that's interesting that I hear resonate in counterterrorism too is the difference between punitive, striking that balance between punitive and behavioral science, and it's something we look at a lot too. And through all these presentations, I think one of the topics of recidivism you know what I mean, has been, and I'm the native English speaker, right, has been a focus for everybody, so I think that's very telling.
Thank you so much. It's working. No, Chris, thank you so much for moderating, and for all the panelists for all the interventions. Apologies if I go a little bit beyond the time, but I think I wanted to hit a couple of notes. First, just to highlight the emerging trends or threats, challenges that we are facing, illustrated by your presentations. Proliferation of non-state armed groups, all sorts, militia, self-defense, terrorist organizations, organized crime, protracted nature of the conflict, in terms of how that poses a threat to all the interventions, the regionalization of violence that go beyond the national boundaries, but also the surge of violent extremism that nowadays is spreading even to contexts where we thought were relatively stable, I would say. And all these challenges, I think, have forced us to constantly review, like dismantle our preconceived ideas, review our assumptions, and constantly revise our policies, our norms, but based on best practices and lessons learned, right? And I think this is a process that has been taking place in the past 30 years. And just building on what, and to echo several things that Chris had mentioned, for example, for years, we have seen different concepts: first generation DDR, second generation DDR, third, fourth, maybe fifth generation DDR plus, DDR, DDRR, DDRR, disengagement, normalization, decommissioning, and I could be on and on and on. But what I see is that there is a common objective, that it's to support the transition into civilian life. But also what I have realized, especially from hearing colleagues, right, there is no one-size-fits-all. Each context is unique. And also, one thing that is important is that concepts don't shape reality. Reality shapes concepts, right? And for example, going back to the point of how to reintegrate combatants in active, I think this was the same question that was faced 17 years ago, the mobilized paramilitary groups or voluntary FARC members. Basically, the answer could be straightforward. We innovate, we adapt, always being careful not to do more damage, detentions, punitive measures, and being pragmatical, right? I think, for example, a couple of points, 3 minutes, a couple of points, national ownership. I think it goes beyond the sustainability, right, of interventions. We know that international support is limited, but I think the national counterparts or the local counterparts, they are clear in terms of the opportunity costs and the trade-offs that they have to make. But and linked to that is the window of opportunity that they have, whether to go for a partial peace agreement, a comprehensive, engaging with the different armed groups, and that speaks to the aspects of mass surrenders, engage with organized crime, what is needed to solve, to end the cycle of violence. The clear legal policy and strategic framework, I think that is critical, and it was mentioned. The need for predictability. What is waiting for you, like after you disengage, right? Be it a child, or a man, or a woman, but this clarity. And at the same time, for example, it was highlighted that leaving a group is a process. So we need to be flexible. We need to be, how can I say, risk tolerance, right? Because oftentimes I see that there is a lot of effort, that is a lot of time that is spent in terms of planning, in terms of design, and getting everything right from the beginning. But what we have seen is that the best approaches are the ones that constantly are evolving, that are based, adopting changes that are well-informed. In Colombia, remember that we had one social worker to 1,500 combatants. So despite the political support, despite the pressure, there is so much that one social worker can do when he's faced with 1,500 combatants. Recidivism and the structural factors, there is a need for comprehensive solutions, right? And I think it's tailored as well, because we have the individual component, we have the community-based rehabilitation, the demobilization, right? But if we don't prevent the recruitment from occurring in the first place, if we don't increase the community capacity to absorb, the resilience of that community, addressing their needs, and also exploring political solutions to really have a sustainable impact. And the last thing, I fully agree with what Lila had mentioned in terms of we cannot force anyone to be reintegrated, a coerced approach. But I think one thing that is interesting, and apologies for going beyond the time, is that we should change the mindset in terms of how we see ex-members. They are definitely subject of benefits, right? But also of responsibilities. In terms of when you're part of this process, you agree, and let's say in exchange of certain benefits, that you will not commit another crime, that you will engage in psychosocial support, you will get education, training, and so on. So you have the elements to advance. And that this duality, a subject of rights and responsibilities, right, is something that allows us to track a little bit more their path. I will stop here, but thank you so much, Chris and colleagues.